We had spent 2 weeks sailing from the north coast of Africa to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. My sons were small boys, yet old enough to feel the excitement as we approached the city. As our caravan came over the last hill, Rufus let out a shout, "Look, Father, the temple!" And there she stood, the earthly palace of God, gleaming as she towered over the city. Though my family had lived in Cyrene for generations, Jerusalem was for us, as for every Jew, our heart's home. The night before, we joined our cousins in Bethany for the Passover Seder that marked the beginning of the festival, sharing a meal and recalling God's salvation for our people. We ended that meal as we did every year, praying for the coming of the Messiah. The next morning, Rufus, Alexander, and I left early to spend the day in Jerusalem, visiting the temple and then the festival taking place near the market. As we approached the city, we saw what appeared to be a parade coming our way. But soon we could see that this was no parade. There were Roman soldiers driving 3 criminals towards the rocky quarry where criminals were crucified. Each of these criminals was carrying a heavy beam across his shoulders. One clearly had been badly beaten, for his body was bloodied and he looked as though he could barely walk. I took Rufus and Alexander by the hand and pulled them away from the road. I did not want them to see this terrible thing. Just then, the tragic figure, the sorely wounded man, stumbled and fell at my feet. I saw that his brow was wrapped in a crude crown of thorns, and suddenly I realized who this man was. This was Jesus of Nazareth, who some claimed was the Messiah. He had been critical of the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem. I could not believe it. They had actually sentenced him to death. Everything happened so quickly. I was lost in my thoughts when I heard one of the soldiers say, "You there, you carry his cross. And you, Jesus, get to your feet." There was nothing I could do. I told my boys, "Stay close." I picked up the beam, far heavier than I had imagined, and pitched it over my shoulder. Then I reached out a hand to Jesus to help him up. He was clearly in pain, but there was still in his face a strength and determination. He looked at me in the eyes as if to thank me, and then he set his face towards Calvary. It was only a 5-minute walk to the place they called the Skull, Golgotha, where the Romans crucified their victims. Dropping the beam before the executioners, I stepped back, searching for my boys, and then we stood and watched as they assembled the cross. Then they stripped Jesus naked and laid him atop the beam. They stretched his arms to the sides before they drove the spikes into his wrists as he shouted in pain. Then they nailed his ankles into the side of the cross, one on the right and one on the left. Finally, they hoisted his cross up and in position, and as they did, he let out another shout of pain. Because I had never been so close to a crucifixion, I had not realized what a horrible thing it was. Rufus began to cry. Alexander became nauseous. There were 2 thieves being crucified with Jesus, and the soldiers hoisted each one into the air. The Romans shouted to the crowd, "Take a look at your king now. This is a lesson from Rome. Don't forget it." The soldiers, laughing, began to throw dice for his clothing. Some in the crowd wept. Others hurled insults at him. The religious leaders stood with their arms crossed, a strange expression of satisfaction on their faces. And then Jesus took a deep breath, and some in the crowd said, "Shh, he's about to say something." This is what he said. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." I would never forget these words. A dying man, tortured and crucified, praying that God would forgive his tormentors. What kind of a man would do such a thing? His words would haunt me the rest of my life. Ultimately, they would be the reason I became one of his followers.